Welcome back. Let's get started. Like heterosexual relations between white men and black women, sex between masters and male slaves undoubtedly occurred, sometimes affectionate and close relationships, but also as a particular kind of punishment. That we have a handful of documented instances is noteworthy, given the prohibitions against sodomy in early America. The absolute power that owners wielded and that enabled them to keep such moments secret, and the shame that was attached to being sodomized by a master and that could ensure the victim's silence. Abolitionist literature demonstrates the possibility of the sexual assault of the enslaved black men by slave-owning white men of what was called the planter class. John Salant, analysts of early abolitionist literature, both showed homoerotic of the literature and provides examples of masters who were said to be sexually abusing their slaves. In one such account, authored by Joseph Lavelle, a slave named Atanico was subjected to rape by a white slaver named Urban. Urban was described as a ravisher, who Atanico explained was struck by my comeliness, and he did violate what is most sacred among men. As Salient explains, although Atanico was rescued, he found himself on a plantation where he met Theodore, whose criminal complaisance with the overseer allows him to give free scope to his irregular passions. As Salient explains, their irregular passions apparently include sexual activity with black men, which Lavelle calls crime, vice, and all enormities, resulting in unbridled disorders and passion. Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, published in 1861 by abolitionist and escaped slave Harriet Jacobs under the pseudonym Linda Brent, included mention of male slave owners sexually abusing male slaves. Jacobs alluded to this abuse in the context of the rape of slave women and girls, lamenting that no pen could give adequate description to the all-pervading corruption produced by slavery. That corruption extended beyond female victims, for as Jacobs wrote, in some cases they exercised the same authority over men slaves. Jacobs' autobiographical account also includes an incident between a slave named Luke and his owner that Abdul Rahman reads as sadomasochistic, and one that reveals in general the entwinement of desire and coercion that typifies the master-slave relationships. He writes, Linda remembers Luke as a particularly degraded figure, sent to the master's son, a man described in coded terms as a depraved, homosexually inclined individual. It was in this man's service that Luke became prey to the vices going out of the patriarchal institution. Rahman points, for example, to passages in Jacob's like the following: the fact that the young master was entirely dependent on Luke's care and was obligated to be tended to like an infant, instead of inspiring any gratitude or compassion towards his poor slave, seemed only to increase his irritability and cruelty. As he lay there on his bed, a mere wreck of a manhood, he took into his head the strangest freaks of despotism, and if Luke hesitated to submit to his orders, the constable was immediately sent for. Some of these freaks were of a nature too filthy to be repeated. When I fled the house of bondage, I left poor Luke still chained to the bed of his cruel and disgusting wretch. Even while most of the accounts illustrating sexual abuse of enslaved men came from the 19th century, 18th century sources indicate the practice was not limited to that era. Slave owners' diaries, for example, also reveal instances of sexual assault perpetrated by masters, indicating that the literary examples reflected a certain social reality. The 18th century diary of a Jamaican planter named Thomas Thistlewood tersely noted 2 incidences of homosexual assault. In one entry he recorded, report of Mr. Watt committing sodomy with his Negro waiting boy. The language is specific enough to indicate that this was a case of sodomy, not the more common attempted sodomy found in the historical records. It also notes the power dynamic within a power dynamic by singling out a boy and not an adult man. Thistlewood's diary also noted strange reports about the parson and John his man. While the term strange reports is not precise, Trevor Bernard interpreted it as meaning homosexual activity. Again, it is worth noting that this act occurred between a slave owner, personal servant, rather than with a field hand. As such, this follows a broader pattern that suggests the closer to proximity to white, the more likely that sexual abuse was to occur. And that is a See what I'm saying? In one of my videos, I said it's all a psychological game. And the game is played to make you look like they really are. Everything that they accuse black men and black women of being is actually how they are. Let's continue. In the story from 18th century Maryland that opened this article, clear that the unnamed enslaved man was also a victim of sexual assault. Yet such stories have rarely been told by historians, and this account itself was documented only by chance. One of the white perpetrators of the assault, William Holland, was convicted of assault and battery. Elizabeth Amwood. Holland petitioned the governor of Maryland for a pardon. Included in the pardon file was a memorandum from Amwood detailing the assault. The case illustrates the sexual vulnerability of black women, to be sure, but we must also recognize the physical and psychological toll that such an event would have taken on the enslaved man, who was unnamed, forced to rape this woman at the point of a gun. Not only would he have had to deal with the legal and moral consequences of assaulting a free black woman, someone he may or may have not known, but his manhood was also usurped. Other accounts of forced sex reveal that male slaves could also suffer punishment for a forced attack. An abolitionist newspaper, the National Era, reported in 1851 on the case of another unnamed man described only as a Negro man belonging to H. France. The man had been burned at the stake for having attempted to commit rape and for murder. What makes this case unusual, however, is that after the execution, the citizens of Pettis County requested that the France family leave the community, having some suspicion that the Negro was instigated to the perpetration of the deed by his master. In addition to aiding and abetting the murder, the master was criticized for his bad example set before slaves by conversing with them in relation to the virtue and chastity of white women, and in defamation of their character, thereby influencing them to commit deeds of crime and rapine. We must consider that France may well have forced his slaves to assault white women, since to take the story at face value is to accept the rhetoric of the ignorant, animalistic, and docile slave who, excited by France, was set loose upon women. At a minimum, this last story raises questions about how often slave masters used male slaves to inflict sexual punishment on women, whether free, black, enslaved, or white, and about the toll that these forced rapes would have taken on those men who could rarely resist the will of their masters. In this instance, it resulted in the punishment for the slave of death by being burned alive. It is important to note again that the man was unnamed. His designation as only a Negro man dehumanizes him, rendering him in his assault on a woman a symbol perhaps of all black men, but we must rehumanize him as another type of victim in a multi-layered sexual assault perpetuated by white men on both black men and white and black women. Forced sex also took place within the context of so-called slave breeding. For what little documentation we have, we know the practice of forcing slaves to reproduce had colonial roots. Most scholars identify the early 19th century as the period of great expansion of this practice, coinciding with the growth of slavery in the United States and the domestic slave trade. In his account of his experiences as a slave, William J. Anderson described what he knew about one master's attempt at forced breeding. I have known him to make 4 men leave their wives for nothing, and would not let them come and see them anymore on the peril of being shot down like dogs. He then made the women marry other men against their will. Oh, see what it is to be a slave. A man like the brute is driven, whipped, sold, comes and goes at the master's bidding. Many slave owners allowed enslaved men and women to develop personal ties and to form relationships and families of their own choosing. Others, however, clearly took a more active role in selecting for the qualities they wanted in slaves, forcing some to have children or to live as husband and wife. The conclusions that historian Thelma Jennings draws about the power that slave owners held over enslaved women should be applied as well to enslaved men. The white patriarch had the power to force them to mate with whomever he chose, to reproduce or suffer the consequences, to limit the time spent with their children, and even to sell them and their children. Masters could and did force couples to have sexual intercourse, and if either one showed any reluctance, the master would make the couple consummate the relation in his presence. Now you see why our people are filled with all these sexual perversions, and how it seems like this country always continues to sexualize black men and women. They're not just sexualizing black women, they're sexualizing black men too.
When I ask a dude to just be cool and be somebody, just be himself, he don't know what to do with himself.
If they ain't throwing or money at you, they don't know what to do. They don't know what to say. They don't even know how to act genuine.
Oh, listen to our music. Look at our shows. Look at our movies. Sexualization is what this country consistently does to our black people. It's time for you to stand up and say no more. They can't keep doing it if you don't let them do it. Testimony from a number of former slaves demonstrates how forced reproduction had the dehumanizing effect of labeling certain enslaved men as stockmen or bulls. As Thelma Jennings explained with one example, on Mary Ingram's plantation, the master made the decision on who could and who could not get married. Or in the words of Mary Ingram herself, him select the potly and prolific women and the potly man, and use cinch for the breeder and the father of the women's chillums. In another example, one former slave recollected how Joe was about 7 feet tall and was the breeding's nigger in Virginia. He continued, once old M out to a white man what lived down in Suffolk. D come a Friday, D bring him back Monday morning. Another former slave noted how his master had prevented him from engaging in sexual relations with only one woman, forcing him to reproduce with about 15 women and to father dozens of children. What's going on today? You hear about some of these rappers having 20 and 30. That's generation curses. Y'all need to break out of this. Stop being what do you call them? Studs. Ain't nothing cute about being a damn stud. Out there putting your penis in 50 and 20 and 50 different women, and ain't nothing sexy about that. Just look like your penis is filled with all kind of sicknesses. Ugh. Forcing some enslaved men to produce with many different women denied to them fatherly role, even while it prevented their bonding with them. It's happening today. How the hell you gonna be a father to 12, 15, and 20 different children? Somebody gonna be left out. It's impossible to do that. A Texas woman had been enslaved attested to this result when she noted that half of us young Negroes didn't know who our fathers were. One slave woman, Mary Young, remarked, "We never hardly knew who our father was." Another slave, Millie Williams, also commented, "Shucks, nobody knows who their father was." Forced coupling also placed a premium on young and healthy men and applied the lesser value of men who were beyond years thought suitable for reproduction. As Thelma Jennings explains, the former slave Lulu Wilson noted that her father was forced off the plantation once the slave owner considered him to be too old for breeding. Ooh. Other men who had been young enough to reproduce but were deemed undesirable were prevented from fathering children. One Tennessee slave woman remarked that a scrubby man would not be permitted to father children. Another slave woman, Polly Cancer, noted that her suitor was forced by her master to stop seeing her and told to get because he didn't want no runts on his place. The scholarly focus reflecting the sources has generally forced couplings from the point of view of the assaulted woman who neglecting the male participant. Thus, for instance, despite the rich testimony she mobilized to explain the sexual exploitation of enslaved women when discussing miscegenation, Thelma Jenkins concludes that only the bondwoman could be subjected to the white man's passion, overlooking the broader power that white men also held over enslaved black men's bodies and sexuality. Still, the sources can provide that evidence. In one example, a slave woman named Rose Williams of Texas fought off a slave man, Rufus, despite their owner's decision to place them together. Rose described Rufus as a bully and explained, "I don't like Rufus." Accordingly, when he attempted to crawl in bed with her, she argued with him. He never responded with physical force, but instead pleaded with her that she should hush and said to her, "Dis am my bunk too." Rose used physical violence to discourage Rufus from being intimate with her, giving him a shove and taking a poker with which she lets him have it over the head. Rufus did not respond with force, but did let her know that they's gwine learn you something, indicating the punishment that would await for her disobeying their owner's intentions. The account, as told by Rose, rightly positions her as a victim, but we should not overlook that Rufus himself was placed in a position of powerlessness by his owner. Rufus did not retaliate physically even after being assaulted. In the end, however, Rose capitulated after being threatened by her mistress. In addition to being forced into sexual situations with women they did not choose, enslaved men could also face the emotional withdrawal and resentment of the women they were then supposed to seduce and marry. Rufus, for example, faced the physical resistance of Rose Williams. After the freeing of the slaves, she was able to leave Rufus, with whom she bore only 2 children, which some had taken to suggest a resistance to him throughout their marriage. Jenny's observations on the psychic trauma of forced marriage for women should also be applied to men. Forced marriage, she argues, caused both physical and mental anguish and may have even caused greater humiliation than concubine, since marriage was long-term. A level of resentment and even hatred could more easily be aimed at the enslaved male husband than at the slave master or white overseer. One woman, Mary Gaffner, told her interviewer, "I just hated the man I married, but it was what master said do." In forced coupling, the levels of victimhood were multi-layered. Men such as Joe in Virginia, who were forced to have children with many women, might also have found themselves unwanted within the slave community. These unions might have led to children who would have been desired by the white planter class, but certainly not always by enslaved women. Some slave women, for example, rejected husbands and lovers because of their promiscuity, as did one woman on account of his having so many children. Dorothy Gray White notes in one example that after a slave named Molly lost her husband because he ran away, she was given a new husband, meaning forced into another arrangement to produce children, despite having 9 children together. However, Molly later rejected this man and exclaimed that he was not her real husband despite cohabitation. In Molly's heart, her real husband was the man sold away by their master. For such men, the rejection and resentment of their forced wives would have further compounded their dehumanized situation. Records from the period immediately after slavery indicate the desire of former slaves both to find family members who had been sold away and remove themselves from forced spouses. Men and women found themselves able to extricate themselves from sexual partners they had not selected and in many cases not wanted. General Assembly, for example, created legislation for those who sought to legalize their chosen families and spouses, but came under fire for failing to address the problem of those who had previously been forced into marriage and who were opposed to being regularly joined in the bonds of matrimony and these unwanted spouses. The forced coupling of enslaved men and women denied the individuality of both, continuing to overlook the victimization of men and sexual assaults. Not only denies the full extent of that sexual abuse, but also continues dangerously to draw long-standing stereotypes of black male sexuality that positions black men as hypersexual. In some instances of forced masculinity coupling, undoubtedly some men took pleasure, as did some women. In other cases, for both partners, it may have been a last resort to avoid punishment from masters or overseers. In such cases, white men controlled the bodies of both black men and women, and they seem to still be controlling the bodies of black men and women. Open your eyes and check it out. The traditional denial of white women's sexual agency has contributed to our obscured view of those white women who sexually assaulted and exploited enslaved men. Indeed, the abuse of black men at the hands of white women stands on its head the traditional gendered views of radicalized sexual assault. Yes, as historians have demonstrated, despite the legal and cultural prohibitions against sex between black men and white women, In early America, occurrences were far from rare. Many examples from a wide range of sources demonstrates no outright violence or threat of physical harm to the black men enslaved and free, but highlight that it was well understood that white women did at times take the initiative in these interactions. As with relations between white men and enslaved women, sexual contact between white women and enslaved men ranged from affectionate to violent. Even presumably affectionate and long-term relationships must be reconsidered given the context of slavery. As scholars remind us, the apparently affectionate relationships of enslaved women and white men took place within the context of absolute power over life and limb, and therefore must not be viewed as consensual. Getting tired of some of you black men just swearing up and down that some of these black women love that. You put yourself in this situation. If you have this other mankind that exuded so much power and authority over you, told you what to eat, told you when to eat, told you what to drink, had power over what clothes you wore. You were nothing. You were less than a cattle to them. You were less than cattle to them. Imagine the brutality they witnessed on a daily basis. Done to, it didn't matter if it was a child, if it was an infant, if it was an adult. You damn right some of them was going to do what they were told to do because they didn't want to suffer that brutality. Some women went along with it because it was called self-defense, protection, perseverance. Just to live to see another day. Or be tortured and abused because they stood up and fought. Some of them didn't want to do it and they fought and they lost their lives. But some of them didn't want to lose their lives, and some of them didn't want to be beat to death or tortured, and only God knows ways they were tortured. And you want to call black women bed wenches. I know you're referring to the black women that supposedly, seemingly, willingly want to be with white men, but you don't even know the context of that. And in a sense, and to be real with you, where are you treating black women any better? That will make them reject the advances of white men. Be like, nah, I love the way my black men treat us. Why I don't want to be with you? There's a reason why some of them turned away and went to white men. Have you ever thought of that? Even though with the brutal and disgusting history between black women and white men, they still would choose a white man over you. That says a lot. And it ain't saying it ain't good. Few scholars, however, have viewed the relationships of enslaved men and free white women through the lens of sexual abuse, in part because of gender assumptions about sexual power. White women's desire for sexual intimacy with black men was noted by more than one early American observer, sometimes in the form of derisive attacks against women involved. For example, in 1731, one white woman declared about another woman that she would have jumped over 9 hedges to have had a Negro. One Maryland planter commented in 1739 that a white woman who had heard about a slave rebellion from one of her slaves did nothing because perhaps she had a mind for a black husband. In 1769, after giving birth to a black child, one woman in Maryland was condemned in a newspaper for polluting her husband's bed. And another woman in 1785 in Virginia was punished by her church for committing fornication by cohabiting with a Negro. Thomas' 18th century diary denounced a white woman in Jamaica who was making free with male slaves. His comment, although brief, indicated her agency in the matter and reminds us that in such cases, it is wrong for us to assume that the enslaved man would be necessarily perceived as the sexual aggressor in such encounters. Phillips Morgan research on the 18th century Chesapeake and Low Country regions of the American colonies revealed numerous instances of white women engaged in sexual relationships with enslaved men. In early 18th century Maryland, for example, one woman who lived with an enslaved man had 7 children. Although Morgan emphasizes the man's agency in this instance by noting that she bore him 7 children. The divorce case of Dorothea and Louis Bourne, a focus of Holt's study and mentioned above, reveals another instance that tells us that such cases were far from rare. In this 1825 divorce, testimony from neighbors and friends revealed that Dorothea had enjoyed a long relationship with a neighbor's slave, Edmund, with whom she had several children. Neighbors revealed themselves to be well aware of her conduct, and perhaps more surprisingly, did not frame it as wholly unusual. Martha Holtz argues that this incident provides yet more evidence that black men were not necessarily assumed to be the initiators in such relationships, and that the figures of the aggressive black man and the sexually passive white woman had not yet emerged as cultural stereotypes. Okay, I'm going to put a pin in it, and I'm going to come back with part 3. Thank you so much.